Alright, hello and welcome back to round 3 of the BlitzFuel Invitational 2025. This was a norm round robin that took place over the last week or so. As we saw in the first two videos, I went into round 3 with an even score, 1 out of 2, in a very strange way, losing with white and winning with black. So far having the white pieces was not a big advantage. So even though, in principle, when you sort of map out the days in your head, you think, okay, every day is pretty much going to be 2 games in a day. I'm going to have black in one game, I'm going to have white in the other. I'm going to try to draw the game with black, I'm going to try to win the game with white. So going into today, that was obviously my intention. I was trying to draw the previous game with black and try to win this game with white. So most of my opening preparation energy actually went to this game and not round 2, which I managed to win nonetheless. And kind of good thing that I didn't do a lot of preparation for round 2 because my opponent surprised me on move 2 anyway. But going into this game, I was feeling kind of good. I mean, I was coming off a win. Like I said in the last video, my first big win, or like serious win, in basically a year. I was feeling like, okay, I am seeing things relatively clearly. I calculated well. I had good intuition for evaluating the position. Like, I wasn't afraid of having the isolated pawn, which has been a problem for me in the past, like very much overestimating the side playing against the isolated pawn. So I felt good going into this game. I was playing against International Master Alexander Ostrovsky, who also is one of the main driving forces behind organizing these events. We had played some... I don't think we actually played that many times growing up, but we played in the same area, a lot of the same tournaments, so definitely seen a lot of his games. And I knew from both that and looking at his more recent games that he's been a lifelong Caro-Kann player. Knows his openings very, very well, understands the positions very, very deeply. And so when you're playing a player like this who plays basically only one opening, which makes it very easy to prepare for because you can have a lot of faith that they're going to stick to the thing that they've been playing for 20 years. The flip side of that is that even what are you really going to prepare in like 2 hours that they haven't seen in 20 years? It's very difficult to find something like truly new for them. And if you end up in a situation where you play your preparation and they've seen it before, like maybe they haven't had it over the board, but they've seen it before in their own sort of home analysis, and they have something ready for you, then you have 2 problems. Like, first of all, you've been out prepared, which is very likely when they're playing their main opening, and second of all, you're playing a position that you probably haven't really seen before. Like, maybe you looked at it for like a few minutes with an engine, but not much more than that. Whereas your opponent might have, they've certainly played very similar positions because they play this opening a lot, but they might have also seen the exact position. So it's always a little bit of a gamble between, should I just enter their main opening and then try to surprise them with something, or should I, completely deviate, just play a completely different move one, say, all right, congratulations, you got me, like, you're better at the Caro than I am, I'm just going to play, like, knight f3, or c4, or something, and just try to get a game. And so in my career, I've done both, with probably about the same frequency, but in more recent years, I've decided that I shouldn't really be scared of main lines. Main lines are main lines for a reason. They're the strongest, they're often the most natural moves. All of the theory is sort of built around the main lines because it's like what both sides want to do anyway. Like, this is what they would do in most of these positions. You would just kind of play the same ideas. So even if you avoid the main lines, like, you're not really avoiding the main lines. And so I decided we should just go for it. So to no surprise, my opponent did play the Caro-Kann. I played the advance, which is certainly the most challenging. And my opponent gave me a slight surprise here by playing bishop f5. For a very long time, my opponent was exclusively playing c5, and I had some ideas prepared here, of course. I wasn't, like, coming in completely unarmed. But there's a few ways for white to play the position from here. A line that's been very topical recently is playing knight f3, cd, queen takes d4, which looks a little bit strange, but it's connected with a specific idea. It allows knight c6 harassing the queen, but white goes to f4, putting some pressure on f7. And then white would like to follow up by playing, for example, knight to c3, knight to d5. Very, very aggressive stuff. Sometimes c4, trying to open the d-file. Putting a knight on d6 is another reason that the queen is on f4. There's a large body of theory that's starting to evolve here, and at this point probably has mostly evolved. I think this is pretty well researched by now. But this is one way that white can continue. Another way is to simply grab the pawn and try to hold it. Black could play e6, black could play knight c6, both are options. But after knight c6, white is, again, a wide variety. Knight f3 is possible, bishop e5 is possible. Even f4 is possible, just like really arguing that, yes, I can actually hold all these pawns. After e6, we'll play bishop e3, c3, b4, and just try to completely lock down all the dark squares is certainly an option. But I had some specific ideas of what to do here. There's many continuations I could have chosen, but my opponent played bishop f5, which is the more common move in general, and I slightly expected that he would go for this, to be honest, because he does have some recent games in this line, and I expected that if he was going to deviate at all, fearing preparation, like he's probably not going to like swap openings entirely and just not play the Caro, but this is like one point that you can deviate if you suspect that your opponent has come well prepared. You can sort of decide whether to play c5 or bishop f5, because both are very acceptable ways for black. And so I had a few ideas of how to continue here, but I decided to continue with this main line that I've been experimenting with. If you've seen my stream at all, which you should, hint hint, you'll know that this is a line that I've been experimenting with. It's basically an attempt to get the short variation. So for example, knight f3, bishop e2 is very topical, without allowing c5. So in this position, c5 would be the main move, and after bishop to e3, queen to b6. And there's a large body of theory here involving sacrificing this pawn on b2. Black, I think black doesn't actually take it nowadays, but you know, there's a large body of theory that evolves around it. And so knight d2 is sort of an attempt at achieving a similar position without allowing the c5 idea. So after e6, which my opponent played, we played knight to b3, trying to build a little bit of a lockdown before going for knight f3, bishop e2. And so black continues normally with, like, let's say knight to d7, knight f3, knight to e7, castle, bishop e2, preparing castles. Black has to decide how to develop his pieces now. Knight g6 is always a little awkward because this bishop can run into trouble. So black has a few ways. One way is to play h6, castle, and then either g5 or bishop to h7, just preparing to play knight g6 without the bishop sort of being stranded. After g5, which I think is more of the main stuff nowadays, white usually plays knight e1, getting out of the way. Bishop to g6, intending knight f5. Game continues, but white is very happy. Well, I mean, this is definitely the type of setup that white wants in the short variation usually. And so by move order transposition, we've gotten there in a way that doesn't get into the c5 lines. So most of the theory that's developed around this is oriented around, okay, how does black get in c5 safely? Black can actually do it immediately, it is worth noting. And then after takes, black can recapture the piece with this fork. This is a very common trick. And now black has gotten kind of the structure he wants, but he's had to give away the two bishops to do it. And so white has, you know, generally argued that there's still some advantage to play for here after knight f3, knight e7, knight d4, harassing the bishop, bishop g6, like f4. There's also like knight b5, bishop to e3, harassing the queen. The game continues. I mean, black is not much worse, but it's not to everyone's taste to just give away the two bishops and just kind of sit sadly for most of the game. So my opponent played a6, which is another way to try to get in c5 without allowing any like stuff around the b5 square. For example, the knight can no longer come to b5 for this maneuver, which is sometimes relevant. Knight f3, and now my opponent did go for c5, using the same trick. For a while, I never really understood why people throw in a6, to be honest. I'm still not 100% sure that it makes a lot of sense. Because we're not usually concerned about piece landing on b5 all that much. Like, for example, if you go back to the position where black goes ahead and takes immediately, after knight f3, knight e7, knight d4, like, black can just play a6 now if he's really concerned. Or more likely just castle, and we don't really care that something's coming to b5. So whenever I see a6, I'm like a little bit happy, because I'm not sure that I'm not sure it's the most consistent. It's still fine. I mean, objectively all of these things are fine, but I'm generally reasonably happy to see it. So knight f3, c5 was played, and this exchange happened. So again, bishop e5 is not possible. So bishop e3 is a move that is very natural, comes to mind, because it harasses this queen. It develops with tempo, basically. The main problem is that queen c7 is very desirable for black anyway, because he'd like to put pressure on this e5 pawn. So we're pretty much forcing the queen to a better square. Whereas with the queen on c5 can actually get in the way, because if black would love to play knight c6 a lot of the time, but he also doesn't want to block the queen coming back to c7. So we actually prefer to postpone bishop e3 as long as possible, which is a bit of a subtle idea. It's one that I didn't appreciate for a long time until I was studying this line for quite a while. But instead we would like to generally get the rest of our setup completed first before committing to bishop e3. And this starts with a move knight to d4, preparing f4. So one of the downsides to a6 now is that bishop g6 is actually kind of difficult to get in, because black has spent a move on a6 which actually doesn't interfere with white's next idea, which is queen to a4 check. Now because of this pin on the a file, black certainly can't play b5, for example. White can just capture. And if black blocks the check either way, for example knight d7, now this move that black intended to stop, knight b5, comes anyway because of the pin, and there's no good way to stop knight d6 check, so black is already in very, very, very serious trouble. In fact, black already needs to find some pretty precise moves not to just lose, which is king to f8, bishop to e3, queen to e7, knight d6, take on e5, bishop c5, which is very powerful. This diagonal is very unpleasant. Now only move queen c7, allowing knight takes b7, but allowing the development of the bishop. And then after all of this, black kind of limps to a much worse endgame. This is all a very long forced line that is known. After takes, rook b8, knight c5 saves the piece because of the threat of the fork. King moves knight a4, and after this very long line, maybe this has even been played before, but this is definitely very well known. White has two bishops, pressure on the a6 pawn, very, very comfortable position for white. So instead of bishop g6, my opponent played knight e7, giving away both bishops, so now white has the advantage of two bishops, which I felt I should take immediately. I wasn't quite sure. There are other ways to play the position. I could play, for example, h4, trying to grab some space on the king side. I could develop normally. For example, just bishop e2 would make a lot of sense. Bishop e3 is more viable now that we can meet queen c7 with f4, but still should be postponed. Ideally as long as possible until they commit to the knight c6 move. But I decided that it would make sense to grab both bishops here. Knight takes, bishop to d3, knight to c6, and here I castled. Now, there's a tactical justification to castles because, of course, black is attacking this pawn, but in this case we are able to deliver a deadly pin on the e-file. It might not look like it immediately because we're not able to immediately follow up with f4 due to the pin, so after f6, white needs to find this move queen d4, which breaks the pin to prepare f4, and if the queens are exchanged, then this pawn enters to put pressure on the pin with pretty deadly effect. Not terribly difficult line, but a nice justification nonetheless. And so black is obligated to play something other than knight takes e5. The main option that I was considering was to move d4, just trying to open the d file, also deal with the center a little bit, and put more pressure on e5. In this case, I was going to most likely have to take, trade a bunch of stuff. And then I wasn't sure if I should keep the queens on or not. I think both are kind of reasonable. Like, queen b3 is possible to go after b7. Trading is also possible. Rook d1, knight e6 most likely. Bishop e3, and I wasn't quite sure how to evaluate this position. You know, on the one hand, most of my pawns are going to be fixed on dark squares, which makes this bishop feel a little uncomfortable. And on the other hand, I do have immediate control of the d-file, which is nice. It makes it very hard for him to castle, for example, after rook d7. His structure is a little bit compromised on the king side as well, so not the easiest to, like, generate a passed pawn in some lines where we end up trading a bunch of, like, trading off the minor pieces, for example. I thought, I mean, objectively it's probably supposed to be equal, and indeed it is. If anything, it's actually probably easier to play black, because if all the rooks come off, then black has a serious advantage with these, the pawn structure being a little bit unfortunate. But there are other ways to play too. I mean, queen f3 is possible, queen b3 is possible, bishop e3 is possible, trying to get a better version of the queenless endgame. And also after d4 is other option. I mean, I don't have to take on f5. You know, queen b3 again is an option, going after the b7 pawn. Bishop d2 is an option, just giving away the e5 pawn and playing with the two bishops. Like, it is a little bit dangerous for black to open the position in principle, because, again, white has two bishops. So my opponent opted for castles, which looks a little safer, a little more stable, so I was expecting castles. I honestly didn't... I mean, I don't know what I was expecting, to be honest. d4 and castles both made sense. I think I wouldn't have been surprised to see either of them. But here I spent a long time thinking, because... I mean, white would like to be able to play some combination of the moves g4, bishop e3, f4, kick the queen, get, you know, all of the pieces remaining developed, and then start some operation on the king side, and trying to generate an attack with the two bishops. And this king being a little bit loose where it is. There's not a lot of support right now. There's only like one piece sort of defending it. So I eventually did settle on playing the move g4, but it is a very dangerous move to play, because it does open up white's king quite a lot. For example, one line that I was looking at for a while was knight h4. Just trying to put some pressure on the newly weakened squares. And then, for example, bishop e3 here would already be a very, very bad blunder, because after d4 takes, it looks like white is getting away with all of this because we have some tricks with bishop takes d4, takes, and bishop takes h7. But, well, there's two buts. First of all, the line actually continues here, because after takes knight f3, black is recovering the queen and keeping his extra piece. So we can't actually do that. But also there's this really nasty move, which might be even stronger, queen to d5, not recapturing the bishop, which you would think is automatic. And instead threatening checkmate. Now white is forced to play f3, and now the capture comes with check, very importantly. So black is giving check, picking up all of the pawns, white's position completely collapses immediately. So after knight h4, bishop e3 is not possible. Instead, we would have to play bishop g5 first to kick the knight again. And then after it comes to g6, only now play bishop e3. So now if the queen moves, now f4, white gets exactly the setup he's hoping for. And this is a very, very comfortable position for white now. Black does not have a lot of counterplay. So in this position, black would have to play d4, which is also a very good move. Now after takes, yes, black cannot take because we take on g6 and open up a discovery on the knight. But black simply plays slower, queen to d5. The queen is extremely well placed here. Again, that h4 is kind of a threat already. Also, rook d8 is coming. Maybe this rook, not really sure which. I mean, maybe both. Like, it might not matter because they might go to d7 anyway. Black will eventually recover this pawn. This pawn is very, very difficult to hold. And that leaves a situation where white does have two bishops, so the opening of the position is nice, but this pawn is very weak. There's not going to be a lot of firepower involved. White's king is a little bit airy still, so black would probably end up being mostly fine in this sort of position. It was probably going to play f3, for example, rook d8, bishop e4, queen b5. Now this starts on both pawns, so black will recapture at least something. And then after something like queen b3 takes, rook d1, we end up with a situation where these bishops are very powerful. Technically black is up a pawn briefly, but it will fall. I think there's still something to play for white, but objectively black should certainly not be in super serious danger. The other option after g4 is to do what my opponent played, which is to go back to e7 with a very similar idea. I was happy to see it, because I was definitely more concerned about knight h4, but this should also be fine for black. So bishop e3, queen a5. Now d4 is much less powerful, because this knight is not really contributing, and so this king is a little bit more open. For example, instead of having to go to f3, instead of having to resort to f3 to play bishop e4, we can play like queen, I guess b1 to avoid knight b4. Queen b1 looks very nice here. Putting pressure on h7, and after something like h6, we can play maybe even check in bishop e4, but bishop e4 is also very simple. And then white is just kind of... Now white can hold this pawn much more comfortably. This pawn is also well defended. So this pawn sacrifice doesn't really work immediately for black. Instead, he went queen to a5. And now after f4, we get our setup again. So my opponent spent a very, very long time on this move, almost half an hour, which, you know, in a 90-minute game is a lot, especially when you're down to 51 minutes. And he played d4, which I thought made a lot of sense. In fact, I thought it was basically forced. Because if black plays any other move, like rook d8, trying to prepare d4, then b4, queen c7, bishop c5 is coming. And this construction is very, very solid for white now. It's very, very difficult for black to break. Now d4 is never really accomplishing much, because after takes, it's basically impossible to ever take back. We always have tricks with bishop h7, the bishop is coming to d6. It's very, very, very unpleasant for black. And if there's no d4, then it's not really clear what black's idea is, ever. Because the bishop, again, is just going to come to d6. We're going to start mobilizing our forces towards the king side, push the pawns, and most likely black loses quickly. So I thought d4 was basically forced, practically. Eventually, he did play it. I went ahead and took. He played knight d5. And now this would immediately regain the pawn because of the threat to this bishop. Like, I don't really have a good place to put it. If I went to d2, for example, harassing the queen, then after queen b6, there's threats on both pawns. d4 will drop. b2 will probably also drop. Now the king feels very uncomfortable. And if I try to defend the pawn, there's sort of... I mean, possibly the same problem with queen b6, but even more to the point is just rook d8, and I can't defend this pawn any longer. This bishop on e3, despite sort of staring into nothingness, is actually a very important piece. But fortunately, I have the nice move bishop f2, keeping this entire construction very solid. And black is not able to capture the apparently hanging pawn in f4 because bishop e1 opens a very nice discovery. So in this position, black has to prepare to take the pawns first. For example, queen b6, maybe queen b4. My opponent went for rook d8, which I think is a little inaccurate. But here I started to spend a long time. I spent like 20 minutes here. I was going to play the move queen to f3 instantly. It's a very natural move because, first of all, it gets off the d-file. Second of all, it defends the f-pawn, which is now a real threat, by the way, because this whole idea with bishop e1 is much more dangerous with the d-file open. For example, if I just play nothing move, and it takes f4, bishop e1. Now if there's something like check, takes, like this, all of this is just kind of collapsing. We can't really hold everything together. Bishop e2, for example, runs into queen e3, opening attack on the queen. So white actually probably has to like give the piece back and just be a little bit worse even after rook takes. So we do have to defend this pawn. So queen f3 is like the most natural way to do it. But I spent a long time calculating queen d2. Eventually I did play queen f3. And queen d2 is a very annoying move. Black is now, again, once ready to take on f4. And it's not that easy for white to defend this pawn. So the main line that I had calculated was move queen to e4, making a counter threat of checkmate, which needs to be stopped. So black plays g6, most likely. Now bishop to h4, putting pressure on the rook. Rook to d7. Rook to f2, attacking the queen and holding the b2 pawn. Queen to e3. And then if I had mostly calculated rook to e1. Now if the exchange of queens happens, bishop takes, white is doing extremely well here because this pawn is mostly cannot be captured, with the bishop on h4 providing really, really good support for a doubling on the d-file. And white will basically just win a pawn here and probably the game. But I'd overlooked completely the move queen h3. Like, I didn't even see it was legal during the game. And now white is actually in trouble. Bishop g5 is forced. H6. The bishop is basically trapped. We have to play bishop f1 to give away this pawn. And now the queen is not really getting super trapped here. Or, well, I guess it is, but, like, black is very happy to play this queen down position now. And in fact, I think it's actually easier for black to play because the d4 pawn is going to be taken eventually, like just knight e7, for example, and this pawn will fall. And it seems, it's very, like, there's no targets for white is the problem. Like, if this d4 pawn falls, the e4 pawn also falls. we don't really have time for like h4, h5 ever. I think it's actually very uncomfortable for white. I was happy. I was happy after the game to see that my opponent didn't go for this. But the computer finds a very nice defense here, which is just a very cold-blooded f5. I didn't really think that this was possible because there's just like all sorts of ideas. I was mostly concerned about, for example, knight f4. And now after rook d1, the problem is there's knight takes e5. Now if I take, rook takes d3, rook takes d2, rook takes f3, and this configuration is extremely powerful for black. I can't really dislodge... I can't dislodge this rook because this knight controls the g2 square. h5 is coming to break down the structure, very similar to like game 1, how the king side completely collapsed. I thought that white was actually in very big trouble here. But what I missed in my calculation was this very cold-blooded computer move. Just simply ignore everything, play queen to g3. Renew the threat on the queen. And now after queen takes b2, the even more cold-blooded move, even if I had seen... I don't think I considered queen g3 at all, but even if I had considered it, here I would still be very annoyed, because we still can't take on f4, because knight takes d3, and if takes, there's queen takes a1, so, you know, it's just an exchange of pieces. But the computer finds like one of the most cold-blooded moves I've ever seen, which is the simple move bishop to f1. And astonishingly, there's no way for black to recover. Like, both of these knights are hanging, and they can't both be defended. So black is obligated to sacrifice a piece for several pawns. And even here, it's not clear. I mean, black has 3 pawns for the piece, but it's a very healthy piece at this point. Black doesn't really have any obvious targets anymore because all of the obvious targets have already been taken. So white, I think, has decent chances to win the game from here. Certainly not going to be an easy conversion, but a very solid advantage. But all of this was completely foreign to me, so I was very, very happy to see knight b4, because I thought queen d2 I wasn't doing super well, to be honest. But my opponent played knight b4, we slid back to b1. My opponent couldn't find anything better than g6, because takes is not possible due to queen e4, and we are tactically winning a piece. So it's not really clear what other idea black should go for. He played g6, which makes sense. Now he is threatening d4, so we played the move rook to d1. But white is starting to consolidate. White is simply up a pawn right now. As long as there's no obvious way to consolidate this pawn, or collect this pawn for black, then white is just going to be up a pawn. The attack is still coming eventually. So at this point I was very confident that I would win the game fairly easily, especially with my opponent having very, very low time. But my opponent found some clever, practical defensive attempts. Here he played queen a4, which is technically objectively inaccurate, but certainly poses some practical problems for white. I played b3, which is also slightly inaccurate. So queen a3, I wanted to play bishop e4, but I actually could have played bishop e4 immediately without any real problem. Not really sure why I didn't do this, to be honest. I think I was like vaguely concerned that, oh, maybe he will actually just take on a2 or something, but that's obviously nothing. So b3 was just sort of helping the queen along a little bit. Still fine. Rook d7, f5, rook d8, putting more pressure on the d-pawn. Found a nice move, rook f1. Now this pawn cannot be taken because we trade everything, and the f7 pawn has no more support. So my opponent played again a really nice move, queen b2. Sort of renewing the threat on d4. Like now if I do nothing, then he actually will take. The correct move to play here is just rook d1, just again keeping the defense. But I got a little scared of like not really anything here. I just got like vaguely concerned that maybe I don't actually have any threats on the f-file and he can actually just start like munching pawns. But this is not very serious. One very concrete idea, for example, is just to play bishop h4, intending bishop f6, queen e3, queen h6, and delivering checkmate on g7. And this very simple plan is actually basically impossible for black to stop, because again, there's just so little pressure on d4. So this would have been much more accurate, but I played what I thought was the more forcing version of it, because I thought he basically had to go back to b2 here, and then I would play, you know, bishop e3 maybe, with very similar ideas, maybe takes, and then bishop h4, like all of the same sort of principle. Because I thought that after queen g5 I had spotted a very specific idea, which was that after bishop e3, queen h4, just basically 4. I mean, he can go to e7, which is maybe even a little more accurate, but then he has no play. So he basically has to go to h4. And now after a3, I thought, okay, now the game is finally over. Because after knight d5, takes, the queen is coming to f7. And I thought I win a second pawn, and now this should be very easy. This was my intention back from rook ab1, so I just kind of mindlessly played all of this. But once we got here, I realized that there is a small problem, which is that after queen takes e6, he has this crazy move knight takes e5. And this pin is actually very unpleasant. So I would have to find the move rook f4. I saw rook f4, of course, but I was scared of g5 because I simply missed that I have check here. This check is very important because after king g8, well, I guess I saw the check, but I didn't really see the point. The point is now black has no threat because of this pin. So this rook isn't actually under any attack, which means we can just play rook f1, and now we're very comfortably winning, hitting the knight, and you know, we have some ideas of sacking the queen for mate. Everything just collapses completely here for the black pieces. But after g5, I had calculated bishop f2, queen h3, queen f6, king g8 takes, and then knight g6. And here I was starting to get a little concerned. Because rook f5 is forced, takes. And then I think the main thing I missed is that I can actually take here. Because I was mainly looking at takes, and I thought this was wholly unconvincing. Like, I'm not really sure that... First of all, that it's even objectively winning. I mean, apparently the computer thinks this is already down to, like, barely plus 0.7. But during the game, I thought I certainly wasn't going to win this. In fact, I can almost already agree to a draw because I wasn't quite sure what my idea was, and I started to get worried that I would even lose this position somehow. So, I mean, a long line, but it scared me off, and so with low time, eventually I panicked and played a really bad move, queen to f3, thinking, okay, fine, I'm still up a pawn, he can't take on d4, I'm just gonna sit on the position, prevent knight e5. So my opponent played queen e7, which is very natural. It gave him the opportunity to play the move h5 to generate some counterplay, apparently, but h5 looks suicidal in low time with given that your king is the one being attacked, so can't blame him at all for missing that move. I still don't entirely get the point, to be honest. So we played queen e7. Now I've had a beautiful idea. I was very proud to find this with low time, which was to move bishop to h6. And now the idea is that after knight takes d4, we play a very nice move queen f6, forcing the exchange of queens and creating a passed pawn. It looks like this shouldn't be possible because black has a couple ways to win a rook with a check. But after knight e2, king to f2, important to go to f2 to hit the knight. Now after takes, f7, rook d8, we don't make a queen immediately, after which black survives, but we just take the knight. And there's no way for black to prevent the queening of the pawn. And so white just wins because he's up a piece. The alternative is knight f3, but we reach a very similar thing here. After takes, just king f2, this pawn is simply unstoppable. So after bishop h6, I thought, okay, it's finally over again. But my opponent found, again, another nice defensive resource. King g8, and now it's not so simple. I played a really, really bad move, queen e3, intending to play bishop g5. A much better implementation of this was h4, and then bishop g5, after which black finally pretty much can resign. There's just no more ideas left. After knight takes d4, we simply drop back, and bishop g5 is unstoppable with a very, very easy win for white. But I played queen e3 thinking, okay, it's the same idea, but I'm out of the way of knight takes d4. But this is bad for two reasons. First of all, knight takes e5, once again, is actually very, very strong. In fact, black is maybe... I think, actually, with time pressure, black would probably win after knight takes e5. Like, I was going to chill and just play h3, but after knight f7, bishop f4, e5, white pretty much has to find rook e1, which isn't that hard. I probably would find it, maybe, but it's certainly not the most obvious move of all time. And then everything liquidates, and, you know, maybe black is even still for choice, technically, but all the pieces come off, and black would save him. Pretty miraculous draw. But fortunately, my opponent took on d4, missing the opportunity. And now I have the opportunity to correct course and play again, just queen back to f2 with the idea of h4 and bishop g5, but if I miss it the first time, I certainly was going to see it the second time. I played the immediate bishop g5, which runs into the only saving move, knight f3. And now after takes, pawn takes, it turns out that this check on f7 is simply meaningless. There's no more attack, and black is no longer in any real danger. After e6, which would be the only other try, trying to go for queen f7 and e7, black very comfortably defends with queen e7, and then it's actually white who has to be a little bit careful in this endgame, I think, because this d pawn is very, very strong. So here I was very annoyed with myself, obviously, for having blown what was clearly winning with a very cleanly winning position with really any number of ways to play, into this position where now, I mean, I knew I couldn't lose really, but it's very hard to even generate any ideas to try to win the game. But I tried my only serious try, I think, which is going into the rook endgame but creating a very powerful pass pawn. And now there's a few ways for black to make a draw. I mean, the simplest is to bring the king back. And so it looks like this could be scary, because if white gets to solidify this pass pawn, then there's very, very good winning chances. Like, if the king was already on d4, then white is probably winning. But white simply doesn't have time for this, because the d pawn is very powerful, and it can be used to distract white's pieces while the rest of the king side is very cleanly mopped up. And then again, like, even black can consider arguing that this is it's actually him that should play on, if white's not like 100% careful. So that would be the simplest, but my opponent played g5, which was very natural. Just trying to disrupt this construction. I played the move rook to f5, hitting the pawn. He played h6, defending it, which makes sense. I thought he could also play d4, which is maybe a little bit simpler, but he went for h6, which is safe. Now we started moving the king in. He played king g8, f7, king f8, king e3, and now suddenly black actually has a serious decision to make, which is more than I deserved, honestly, from this endgame, because now at least black needs to think about things. I think the simplest way to make a draw is just rook c8, abandoning the d pawn and playing for activity. And so after king d4, black would play, for example, rook c2, and then this pawn can never really queen by itself. The king is never going to be able to get close enough to support it, because the rook will always harass it from behind. So black doesn't really need to worry too much about this pass pawn, and so in the meantime, like, all of the pawns just kind of get munched up. And again, if we ever go for this, then black is very comfortably just coming back to the 6th rank, for example, or even like going after these pawns, because we just never have time for something like rook d5. There's always the rook holding it from behind. Truly, rooks do belong behind pass pawns, and then once again, like, even black can argue to be better. But my opponent threw in d4, which seems very natural, but it's actually very bad. And the reason is that now, when black does jettison the d pawn, which will eventually be required, the king will be on d4 instead of d5. And on d4, it holds a lot of the important squares on the 3rd rank, like c3 and e3. For example, even rook d7 here is fine for black. Not because we go into the pawn endgame, because the pawn endgame is very winning for white with the active king, but because black can simply jettison the d pawn with rook e7, and then after takes, play rook to e3, collecting the pawns. But with with black having played d4, now this isn't possible anymore, because after, you know, rook d7, let's say pass, if he goes for rook e7, now we can take, and the king is protecting all of the entry squares. So d4, king d3, now we have a chance again. He played rook d6, and now he's basically intending to go rook b6. So we played b4 to preempt that. I actually I'm not sure I really saw this idea, to be honest, because I thought he was going to shuffle back and forth forever. So I wasn't actually quite sure whether to play a4 or b4. I was kind of lucky, I guess, that I played b4, because I missed rook b6 entirely. After a4, rook b6, then black is completely fine again. But b4 makes it very, very unpleasant. So my opponent tried rook d7, we played rook f6. The whole idea for white is we will eventually trade this pawn for this pawn, and then argue that, you know, we are going to pick up a second pawn, maybe the g pawn, or maybe the b pawn, one or the other, and our pawns are going to be far enough advanced enough that one extra pawn is enough to decide the game. So my opponent tried a5, which was a little bit of desperation. They played b5, which is correct. And after a4, I played a really, really bad move again. Like, maybe like 6th blunder of the game. This was a very sloppy, very kind of a shit show, I guess is the professional term. But I played a really bad move b6. And the idea was just to sort of slightly improve the position of the pawns, because I assumed my opponent was going to keep shuffling and then go ahead and grab b7 and win because this pawn is so far advanced. But I didn't actually calculate the pawn endgame anymore. I just assumed every pawn endgame was winning. But it turns out this one is not, because there's just no entry for the king on the queen side. So after takes, king e6, king c5, king e5, king b5. Black cannot afford to go for the race, which is the main reason that I thought that all these pawn endgames were winning were simply too fast. But like, I don't even think it's that close. After, for example, whatever, blah blah blah, takes, queen. The queen against the king and the g-pawn would be winning anyway, even if the king were already like all the way down here. But without it being down here, there's no question. So black can't afford to go for the race, but black can box in white's king forever, and it's, you know, basically stalemate almost. Like, white could actually lose if he's not super careful. Like a4 or king c4, like h3 would lose, for example, because we'd be forced into playing h4. Obviously we wouldn't do that, probably just play king a4, but it's just a draw. So I was very annoyed that I once again blew it for, you know, the millionth time. But we have to go for rook h6, only way to try to win the game. Rook f3 check, takes the a pawn, rook h7, going after the b pawn. And now there is only one way for black to draw, which fortunately my opponent missed. It's a little unintuitive. I think you're probably still supposed to find it at this level with the black pieces, but it's not that simple, because it is a bit of an uncommon pattern, which is to move rook to a1. And the idea is that the a pawn is simply going to run so quickly that the king will have no shelter. And so when the pawn gets to a2, like, there will always be a check on the first rank to free the pawn. Like, normally we don't want the rook on a1 because it's in the way of the a pawn queening. But in this case, after like rook b7, a3, rook a7, a2, like, the king can't hide anywhere. If the king could be on like g6 or like b7, then white's probably just winning, because this rook would never be able to move. Again, why we never want the rook. We almost never want the rook on like a1 in front of the pawn, because it's just completely frozen here. But here there's no way to avoid a check. So after b7, you know, rook b1, takes. This is a very straightforward draw for black. King e4, king g7. Really any moves draw at this point. Rook a6, like, I don't know, rook b5 is probably the simplest to keep the king cut off. This is a very well-known draw. Eventually, these pawns will be traded and we'll reach a Philidor endgame. But thankfully, my opponent played rook to b3 in this position, which I thought was much more natural. But the problem is, I mean, black's idea is basically the same as the other side, where this rook can never move because it's always tied down to the defense of the pawn. But fortunately, the king is able to assist and control this pawn by itself, which is just in time for the rook to come to the a file and stop the a pawn. So the game continued on for a few more moves, but at this point it was pretty clear that white was winning. And now after b7, there's no defense to king a8 and b8, so we got the win. So definitely the best day of chess I had had in a year. We won 2 games. We beat the GM in the second round, and then we beat, you know, a very strong IM in the second one of the day, in round 3. Moving us back to 2 out of 3 in the tournament, which is still, and this is how hard a GM norm is, like, this is still way below pace for GM norm. Like 2.5 with 2 whites would basically have been necessary. I mean, if I'd won the first game from a very promising opening, then we would be 3 out of 3 here and in very, very promising position. But 2.5 would be like, okay. 2 is very hard because, you know, it sounds great to be +1, but having used 2 of your whites and pretty much playing the lower seeds in the event, like, it only gets harder from here. So you're getting 4.5 out of 6 against the remaining field is still, it's very difficult to see like a realistic path. So I still wasn't really concerned with making a norm from here. I was very happy to get a few points in, because even though I knew that like it was still a long tournament, a lot of things could go wrong, a lot of things could go right. This at least, like, even if I lost like all my remaining games, which is basically what happened, I could at least look at this day and be like, okay, like on my good days, like I can play at a GM level, and I don't know if this game really illustrates it because there was a lot of back and forth in this game, but for most of the game I was controlling it like quite well. I was calculating well. I was seeing a lot of things. The things that I was missing, I don't think were really practical for a human to see all that much. At least in the middle game. I mean, towards the end, it really wasn't that hard. But in the first game of the day against the GM, I played extremely well as well. So I was very happy for this day. But I knew that the next day was going to be an absolute gauntlet, because I was playing the other two remaining GMs in the field, who are both well over 2500, like very strong GMs. And so I wasn't resting on my laurels just yet. All right, we'll close it there. Thanks for watching. Again, feedback is good. This is the first tournament that I'm doing this for, so feedback, I guess, on whether I should do it at all, or if I'm yapping into the void, or how I do the analysis, more lines, less lines, more openings, less openings, whatever. Anything is helpful, so let me know. Thanks for watching. I will see you all in the next video, which will be round 4 of this event against strong Grandmaster, and the next one will be round 5 against the strong Grandmaster. So the next two will be interesting. All right, thanks for watching. See you next time.